Hello there. So, Paul here again, and today's English language A-level video is all about verbs. Yes, where would we be without verbs? Absolutely essential. Life without verbs, it would be like life without chips, just like unimaginable. Okay, so let's have a think about the different categories of verbs that we write about on English language A-level. There are four main categories that are talked about in the textbook. So let's have a look at them. First of all, we have your conventional verbs that when most people think about verbs, this is the one they think of, material verbs. So these are words that show actions or events. There are your superhuman words like hit, jump, wash. So material verbs. They used to be called dynamic verbs, but this is a new regime. So we're going to call these material verbs. Right, then we've got relational verbs. Now these are more abstract words. They're words like be and appear or seem. So these are words that identify properties or show states of being. Thirdly, we have mental verbs. So these are words like think or believe. So these are those verbs that show internal processes such as thinking. So thoughts and emotions are mental verbs. And then finally, last but no means least, you've got verbal verbs. Now, verbal verbs are like say and shout and whisper. And so these are verbs that show processes of speech. So different texts will have different combinations of these types of verbs. If you were looking at a transcript of a football commentary, for example, the expectation is that you'd be looking at a lot of material verbs. If you were reading a philosophy essay, it may well be that you have got lots of mental verbs going on. If you're reading a novel, then presumably the novelist is going to be using a range of verbal verbs when they're representing dialogue. Okay, right. What are these strange shapes we have on this slide? Well, I will tell you it's the difference between main verbs and auxiliary verbs. Okay, so the main verb is a single verb and it expresses the main meaning in a sentence or clause. So in order for a sentence to be a standard sentence, it needs to have a main verb. Okay, so here we go. So, but the auxiliary verb is placed in front of the main verb. Now, auxiliary here means helping. So it's a helping verb. It's placed in front of the main verb. There's an example. I must have been drinking too fast. Not drinking, driving. I must have been driving too fast. So we've got the main verb there, driving, and then we've got the auxiliary verbs there, must have been. So they're all verbs, but they're helping. They're helping the sense of the main verb. Okay, so main verb here, auxiliary verbs over there. Now, auxiliary verbs. There are two types of auxiliary verb. One type is the primary auxiliary verb. Okay, and there just happen to be three of these in English. To be, to have, to do. To be, to have, to do. To be, to have, to do. So we have three primary auxiliary verbs in English, and we use them in order to concoct all sorts of grammatical constructions. For example, if we're going to use the progressive aspect of the verb, e.g. she's working at boots, we're going to put a cheeky little ing inflection on the end there to show that this is progressive. You know, it's an ongoing thing, it's continuous, but we're also going to use a form of the verb to be there to make it standard. We could say she working at boots, but that would be non-standard. So she is working at boots is using the primary auxiliary verb to be in order to form the progressive aspect. If we wanted to use the past tense, then we would say they were, here they go, they were walking down the street, like that. So that's the form of the verb to be on the progressive. What else? Okay, so what about this one? The primary auxiliary verb have. Now we use that to form the perfect tense. So look at this sentence. You have forgotten your mobile, or they had waited for ages. So when you use have or in the past tense had, you're using the perfect tense of the verb. And it's quite complicated in English. We do it quite unconsciously, but we tend to use the perfect form when we're talking about something that's happened very recently in the past, or something that's happened in the past and it's got a kind of impact on the present. So there, for example, you have forgotten your mobile. It's something that's happened in the past, the forgetting of it, but the impact is on the present. So we use the primary auxiliary verb have to construct the perfect tense. And then what about the primary auxiliary verb do? Well, we use this one to negate sentences, to do the negative form, and to ask questions. So, I don't know. There we are. I'm negating the sentence. And did you see him? I'm asking a question. Now, that's changed over time. If you look at early modern English texts, so texts from, say, 400 years ago, let's say Shakespeare, then Shakespeare wouldn't have written, I don't know. He would have said, I know not. Okay, so they didn't in those days use a primary auxiliary verb. And similarly, constructing of questions, they didn't, or at least didn't often use did you see him? It would be seest thou him? Okay, so these are your type 1 of auxiliary verbs, and they're pretty essential for standard English. Okay, here are the second type. These are called modal auxiliary verbs. Okay, now these are words like can, should, shall, might, they keep popping up in strange places, may, must, could, would, how many more of these are there? Will, that's enough, isn't it? Okay, now you can see what these modal auxiliary verbs are doing. You put them before a verb, and what it does, it tells you, the listener, the attitude of the subject towards the verb. Okay, so what you want to do is you want to be popping into that blank there some of these different modal auxiliary verbs and thinking about how that impacts on language, on the meaning, I should say. So let's take can, for example, in the top left. We can go to the party. So this is about ability. You have the potential to go to the party. So it's about potential and it's about ability. On the other hand, we must go to the party. Well, that's all about obligation. It's like somebody has forced you, unwillingly perhaps, to go to this goddamn party. So what I'd ask you to do is pause the video, go through the rest of these modal auxiliary verbs, and have a think about how they impact on the semantics, i.e. the meaning. Okay, right. I'm assuming that you've done that and you've had to think about all of these. So I will go to the party denotes certainty. I shall go to the party sounds a little bit archaic and old-fashioned. It's one of these modal verbs that is perhaps less fashionable now and is less used, but it's pretty certain, isn't it? I shall go to the party. So it's a certain intention that you're carrying out there. I may go to the party sounds more tentative. Okay, it's a possibility that you're going to go, but you're not entirely certain. I would go to the party if I could be asked. So would there is kind of like a conditional. It's like saying in a hypothetical world, I probably would go to the party. I should go to the party, again, sounds like obligation, but it's a bit different from must. Because where must sounds like somebody's told you that you have to go there, should sounds like a moral imperative. I should go to the party. I don't really want to, but I should do. I could go to the party is all about possibility. And I might go to the party is all about uncertainty. So these are all modal auxiliary verbs. They're pretty crucial in signalling to the listener the attitude of the subject, in this case we, to the verb, in this case go. Modal auxiliary verbs. Okay, now there's two words that we can use when we're talking about modal auxiliary verbs, because some of them are, very forceful, high force, and some of them are lesser in force. I'm trying to lessen the size of my head here, but I'm not being very successful. So very forceful modal auxiliary verbs are called deontic, deontic, and low force ones, and this is the bit that's masked by my head, unfortunately, is called epistemic. Right, so what you need to do is, again, stop the video, here are all the modals, and put them on this continuum. So where are you putting each one of them? Is it a high force one, like deontic, or is it a low force one? Okay, I'm assuming that you've done that. Now, obviously, a lot of this will depend on the context. It completely depends on things like your tone of voice, your prosodic features, and it also depends upon the contextual situation. I can, let's think about going to this party again. I can go to the party. So that, for me, that's kind of in the middle. I will go to the party sounds a bit more certain, therefore I'm putting it a bit to the left over here. It's a bit more forceful. It's a bit more deontic than can. I shall go to the party seems even more forceful than that. So I've got will over here, but I've got shall over there because it sounds so forceful. I may go to the party sounds a bit half-hearted, so I'm going to put that over here as epistemic. It's quite low force. I must go to the party is high obligation. I'm going to put that over there in deontic. I could go to the party. It's a bit like I may go, right? It's more epistemic than deontic. I would go is probably more epistemic than deontic, so it's probably on this side. I should go. It's probably over here somewhere. It's a bit more deontic than epistemic. And I might go. That doesn't sound like you're going to go to this party at all. So I'm going to put that over here as epistemic. Okay, so these are useful terms to use when you're observing the effects of modal auxiliary verbs in texts, deontic or epistemic. Okay, so let's have a look at this in context of a text. So how are modal auxiliary verbs used in this advice column to create meanings? So this is a magazine article where somebody has written into the article, "Dear Nikki, since I started the menopause last year, I've put on weight. I travel in my job, grab food from service stations, and I don't get to the gym much. Can you help?" It's from Kim Ratcliffe, who's 49, from Hertfordshire. And here is the answer. Okay, Kim must make the commitment to become more active on a daily basis. Walking can fit into most people's schedules, so Kim should get a pedometer and start tracking her steps. 10,000 steps or 5 miles daily is the recommended amount. For motivation, it's a good idea to set training goals. Now that's all that I'll read out there, but just to get you going on this, so let's look at the first sentence. So Kim must make the commitment to become more active on a daily basis. Now this is a deontic modal auxiliary verb that's being used by Nikki, where she's giving a high sense of obligation about what Kim must do in order to cope with her weight. Okay, now this fits in with the idea that Nikki is an expert. So in this particular situation, she has a certain level of power. Now, we call power in English language, there are sort of two types of this. There's instrumental power and there's influential power. Instrumental power means you have like power of authority over others. So imagine a teacher in a classroom, say at primary school, or a police officer, for example, or a magistrate. These are all people who have instrumental power in those particular contexts. Whereas influential power is the power to influence people. So it's being persuasive. So here, Nikki, I would argue, has both instrumental and influential power. She has instrumental power in the sense that, you know, she is being represented here as an expert who has been brought on to give expert advice. So she has a level of instrumental power. But clearly, she's trying to persuade Nikki. So she also has some influential power as well. So going back to this then, so the deontic modal auxiliary verb links in to the influential and instrumental power that Nikki operates. Okay, so your job is to look at the rest of the passage there First of all, identify which modal verbs are being used. Then think about where you would put them on the continuum, whether it's epistemic or deontic. And then thirdly, think about meanings. So how do these particular verbs add to the meanings in the text? Okay, right. All right, I'm assuming that you've done all that. We will move on to the next stage where, okay, revision about verbs. So this is a revision on what we've covered so far. Can you do the following? Can you name 4 categories of verbs? That was where we started off. Can you name the 3 English primary auxiliary verbs? Can you explain with examples 4 different uses of primary auxiliary verbs? Modal verbs, write down 8 examples, and can you differentiate between categories of modal auxiliary verbs? Okay, so there we have a brief introduction to the mad world of verbs. In the next video, we will go on to things like active and passive voice, but I think that's all we need to do for the time being. So thanks very much, and I hope you found that useful.